experts in the field of Indigenous cultural intellectual property. So we have Dr. Kirsten Thorpe as Senior Researcher at the Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research, University of Technology, Sydney. Anika Valenti, Senior Associate, Terri, Janke and Company, and Rose Barrowcliffe, Post-doctoral Research Fellow, Macquarie University and Queensland State Archives First Nations Advisor. So thank you all for being here today. We're really excited to have you. In this panel, we'll explore ways in which cultural institutions can appropriately care for and manage Indigenous material held in their collections, how institutions can support Indigenous knowledge, and we'll also have an update on the recent government overview on ICIP and potential models for standalone legislation. So thank you for joining us today, and I'll hand over to Kirsten.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks everyone. It's always good to have the session after lunch, after you're not really hungry beforehand. It's great to be here with you and to be back at the National Library. This panel is an exciting topic, and I guess, some of the contributions that I hope to make are to think ahead to a destination of where we want to get to. But firstly, thanks for the invitation to be here. I want to acknowledge that we're on Ngunnawal land and deeply pay respects to elders and acknowledge their care for the land and their continued connection to the area that the library's on. I'm going to talk a little bit about Indigenous stewardship as a concept. So although it's related to ICIP, I want to think about cultural connections and custodianship, and then along with my colleagues Anika and Rose kind of go deeper into the way that we might enact this kind of work within GLAM. And I know that some of you are probably excited and some are nervous, so it's great to have you here listening to the panel. A lot of the research that I do, and I'll introduce myself a little bit, is looking at, I guess, what I see as the major transformations that need to happen in the sector, and what drives me is thinking all the time about lenses of self-determination and how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can have greater control over their cultural heritage materials. So I'm sure that will shine through a little bit. What I want to offer today is a little bit of my doctoral research and looking at the concept of Indigenous living archives on country. And I guess, as I mentioned earlier, really start to get you thinking about the space of how Indigenous cultural flows of information can be supported through local protocols. And I know you might have to translate that a little bit into your institutional context. And I really encourage you to do that. So, a little bit about me and Jumbunna Institute. I think it's always important to know where people are coming from in these talks. Every time I travel and do these talks, my son just texted me saying, "How are you?" And I sent him a picture of the slides. And my mum is always here with me as a great supporter of the work that I do. My family are Worimi people from Port Stephens on my mum's side of the family. And I think as I engaged in my doctoral studies, I realised how much the experiences, obviously, of my family, but in particular my grandmother, really got to me a place of thinking about history and thinking about the impacts of government policy on families. And I've worked in the sector as a practitioner, trained as an archivist for probably the last 25 years. And in that work, I guess I started to become very disillusioned with some of the practices that were happening and the cyclical nature of where people were addressing what I have come to terms as really complex or wicked problems. I always describe the work that I do, though, as in those cultural and collecting institutions as being about where I can, in terms of my own power, find sites where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can have decision-making points and redistribute this power. And I encourage you as well to think about ICIP and the implementation of that in a way that you are also foregoing power to others. So I'm now a researcher at Jumbunna Research at UTS under the leadership of distinguished Professor Larissa Brandt and Professor Lyndon Coombs. There's a little bit about us on screen here. I'm really fortunate to lead the Indigenous Archives and Data Stewardship Hub. And really what our main agenda is to look at what are community research agendas and look at ways that we can use our own disciplinary knowledge to support and empower that view of self-determination. So it's a really fortunate space to be in. And I guess in terms of the work and being at a university that is very much about social impact, is we always want to see where that thinking can hit the ground, both in terms of industry and support for community. So just to mention my two amazing colleagues, Lauren Booker and Monica Galassi, work with me in this team. And I think one of the things that we as a group of people aspire to do is really work with people to make some of the reforms and transformations that are needed, but always thinking all the time about calling out systemic issues, including racism and white privilege and issues that are sometimes really difficult to talk about in institutional contexts, and to think about this as a really important mechanism to support community empowerment, and in my research very much about community well-being. So this is just a really brief summary of the research context. I've probably gone through them all, but you know, we very much focus on looking at the contested nature of archives for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We're really interested in looking at questions of Indigenous archival sovereignty, informed deeply by Indigenous ways of knowing. We want to work with the GLAM sector to undertake these reforms and really be a part of the conversation, and again think about this in a wellbeing context. And importantly for today, recognising the vital importance of ICIP rights being recognised, and for us we're looking more and more at the Indigenous data stewardship, the Indigenous data sovereignty movement, and supporting Indigenous data stewardship in that process. So because I'm the first speaker on the panel, I'm giving a very brief, Anika's going to be the lawyer in the room in a moment and have this conversation between copyright and ICIP, but I find this is a really useful definition of ICIP. So, a lot of people will talk about it in the context of cultural heritage, but ICIP can cover many different forms of traditional cultural expression, so music, performance, artistic work, languages, tangible cultural property, intangible cultural property, and the documentation of Indigenous people's heritage in all forms of media. And when I see that bottom one, that's where it's like, for those of us who are interested in the GLAM sector, it's a pretty profound. Recognising Anika in the room, also Anika's work in terms of Terri, Janke and company, it's been such critical and world-leading work, and the book True Tracks has so much important information in terms of implementation of ICIP. And when I look at this, when I look at the ICIP work of Terri, some of these things really sing out to me in terms of our space. So thinking about, as is on screen here, that ICIP rights are the right to control who can use and adapt ICIP. Importantly, it's about the right of attribution, the right of integrity, and really critical is the right of benefit sharing. And sometimes I think that's missed in our kind of engagement in the GLAM sector. And then obviously contextualising this in what we're seeing nationally, the debates around recognition of our long history and connection to the country. But for my work, what I've got in bold here on the side as well is understanding that we're operating both in a paradigm that we need to acknowledge this long history, but we're also operating in a period where we need to look at redress from colonisation. And Terri's quote there, Indigenous cultures are like Indigenous lands, they're not free to be taken, I think is a really important message for us to think about our work. For me, in the work that I do as well, I draw a lot on the definition of Irene Watson, an Indigenous scholar, talking about the colonial project as a construct and thinking that the colonial project has embodied a centuries-long ongoing campaign to annihilate, define, subordinate and exclude, in inverted commas, the native, and an arsenal of tools have been applied to these ends. And I like to think about the GLAM sector also contributing to this arsenal of tools, and sometimes I think we see ourselves as doing a different job to actually supporting the paradigms of the nation state and supporting colonisation. So I encourage you to think about that in the work that you do, and to think about how does that connect with, again, that idea of cultural flows and how Indigenous knowledges are required to be managed. So before I sort of talk about this idea of Indigenous living archives on country, I just wanted to point out a lot of my doctoral research responded to calls that have been happening for so long. So Henrietta Formal, in the really seminal article in the late 80s talking about Aboriginal materials being held in white hands and Aboriginal people being captives of the archives. And I guess for the remainder of my talk, I wanted to think about this idea that Henrietta Formal talks about at the end, you know, the lack of cultural policy being disastrous for Aboriginal people, and the withholding of cultural information being such a pain point. And Henrietta Formal, even at that time 30 years ago, was arguing that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander revitalisation and resurgence to take place, that we had to own our material in our own right. And I want to pick up on the last point that Formal argues, is that we actually have to start to think about the return of material to country and supporting communities to hold material in community facilities. So within my research, I've developed a new transformative model of Indigenous living archives on country, and I probably just want to take us to this point as I was saying, this is a destination for all the work that we're doing. The diagram on screen shows the different areas within the living archives on country model, but it's really a principle that underpins that material is in the place that it belongs. It's connected to community and it's grounded in Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing. And I think linked to the protection of ICIP rights, the core features that are identified in the model are focusing at the top level on Indigenous wellbeing and archival sovereignty being holistically embedded in the archives. And I think about the archives as being, you know, quite a fluid space of knowledge engagement. That Indigenous knowledge management protocols are enacted and they're defined locally and they're place-based. And they really importantly incorporate things like emotional and spiritual needs. And then finally, that the data sovereignty principles guide the work of the archive. They guide the work of these living archives through transparent and local decision making. So what's important for me in this work and why I wanted to highlight it in the context of ICIP is thinking that we both have an agenda to work backwards, retrospectively, but we also need to design systems in GLAM that embed the protection of ICIP, and we need to have those agendas working simultaneously. I think that while we're in these institutional contexts and we're thinking about new collections, sometimes the terrible thought of filling the gaps, we actually need to make sure that the work that we're engaged with doesn't reproduce harm into the future. So aligned with this idea of Indigenous living archives on country, I'm not going to go into this deeply, really working with the idea of how a living archive on country and the connection of people's cultural materials locally supports Indigenous people's well-being. So part of that is the healing and redress from colonisation, and I guess the truth-telling that we need to have in our sector about the harms that have been produced by our collecting practices. But then we have this new model that we're actually supporting communities to make decisions informed by their cultural heritage materials and to do that in a way that is fully supported by them. So as I mentioned, for me, if that's our destination, if we truly have a country that has, these networked local community living archives, we have to think about ICIP considerations retrospectively. We need to make sure that there's governance and decision-making taking place about the management and care of materials, but then we actually have to start thinking about this new model that I think isn't necessarily always in sight for us. We're sometimes just working on the front line to deal with the damage that's happened. And I like this quote from Nathan Sentence, who was part of the yarning sessions in my PhD. And he sort of argues in this that in order for us to do this, we have to look at disruption. And I know in the GLAM sector, when we start to think about scale, that is very difficult. But I think it's something that we need to think about. We need to think that if we're looking at these truly informed self-determination models and supporting ICIP, that Indigenous people have to be front and centre and have voice in the decision making. So I wanted to sort of sum up thinking about some models of practice. I know that, you know, for all of you here, it's how do you do this transformative work? You know, how do you make a difference? And I just had two things to share around digital access and thinking about, you know, ICIP being incorporated into those processes. I had a little bit to do in my role at the State Library with the Rediscovering Indigenous Languages project, and I've reflected on that really deeply, and again in my research about this great desire for the institution to hand back material that the library had gathered, you know, through the multiple manuscript collections. And, you know, there's real excitement about people gaining access to that, but the paradigm of access was around open access and use of collections online, and that's complex. You know, for me in that project, there were multiple competing interests and tensions, and at the forefront of that were these serious questions that I don't believe were addressed around rights of ownership and attribution, the right for people to control access and use, and enacting a right of reply. I don't think it was fulfilled at all. So I guess one of my contributions to the panel as well is thinking about where's the capacity for us to build these negotiated spaces that are really participatory. And the really important question of how we resource this. This is going to take a lot of work to get people in those conversations to be making decisions. And a couple of things to highlight that I know Rose will touch on briefly. At Jumbunna Research, we've been a part of the Mukurtu project out of Washington State University looking at alternative models. This, in the case, is just a content management system to do that work, but I think it really shows the ability to work in small scale with communities to make decisions, and the suite of traditional knowledge labels and licenses. And we're doing that work through a hub and spoke network. There's been significant investment in the US around the Mukurtu project, and it really is about a community of practice that we recognise to do this work requires new thinking, it requires multiple sets of skills and some real humbleness. So I really think that that's a part of the transformation. And I'm happy to share information with people after. But I thought I would close, you know, going from that, you know, really quickly from this big picture of a destination of where we can really start to think about a healing agenda and a well-being agenda. You know, the reforms that we need to do, the things that they're about, but also reflect on this quote from Alison Whittaker, who talks about self-determination as kind of a, you know, a moment that is temporal. Self-determination can come and go if those rights aren't fully supported. And I guess the final sentence of that is Alison reflecting that in terms of the archives and in terms of GLAM, her perception is that the spaces are open now, but they can be closed down at any minute. And I guess what I would encourage us all to think about in terms of the ICIP conversation is how we build transparency and accountability around that decision making. I'm going to be investigating a lot of these questions as part of my postdoc research, and I'm really looking forward to questions when we get to the panel, so thank you. I don't know how much time I have.
Is it working now? Okay, thank you so much for that. It was really interesting, particularly around the complex issues with GLAM and open access as well, and how we balance opening up those collections that have traditional knowledge. So thank you for that. And next up we have Anika. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Wow. following on from that, oh my gosh. I was like, where's my phone? I need to start taking photographs. My name's Anika Valenti. I'm Senior Associate at Terri, Janke and Company, an Indigenous law firm in Sydney. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today, the Ngunnawal people, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to extend that to everybody, all Indigenous peoples that are joining us here today, and for thank you for bringing us here as well to have this panel session, which is really exciting. Got a chat with Kirsten and Rose beforehand, and you know, we could yarn all day, I think. So good to bring that conversation to you guys. So I'm coming in with the copyright perspective, and a lot of what Kirsten's already talked about is all intertwined with what I'm going to be talking about as well. Just a bit about Terri, Janke and Company. Terri. This one. Terri is a Wuthathia Meriam woman. She's been running her own law firm since 2000. With a focus on intellectual property, but more importantly, Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, and the gaps in our current Western law, and how we can go about protecting ICIP, even though there are these gaps. We're based in Sydney, but also have offices all over the place. I'm now in Adelaide, so one of the benefits of coming out of COVID is that we can all be mobile and be more accessible in different areas of the country, which has been really good for our clients. ICIP, the definition that Kirsten showed you is exactly the same. It's really referring to Indigenous people's rights to their cultural heritage. Much of this was discussed back in 1999, actually, through Our Culture, Our Future, which was one of Terri's first research works into the gaps between copyright law and ICIP. And Kirsten already touched on some of the ICIP rights, but we have, in Our Culture, Our Future, there's a few more listed, and we summarise them when we're trying to explain ICIP into this kind of list to make sure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and First Nations peoples around the world have the right to own and control their cultural heritage, which is what ICIP is, in accordance with their own customary laws, to require free, prior and informed consent. Who's heard that terminology before? Yeah, right. So we're all across that. To be recognised as the primary guardians and interpreters of their ICIP. You know, that it's not for non-Indigenous people to be undertaking interpretation of ICIP without guidance from traditional owners and custodians. To authorise or refuse use. We have a history of take. You know, we come to community, we go on country, we ask for knowledge. That knowledge is taken and recorded and used or stored, and that's fantastic, but where is the authorisation, and where is the ongoing communication and connection with the traditional owners and custodians of that knowledge? To benefit commercially, and that links in with benefit sharing. Where are the benefits coming back to community for access and use of their ICIP, but also collection of ICIP? I think that gets missed. Everybody talks about use, but we're missing the whole collection and accessing element as well. It's just as important in that context. To receive full and proper attribution and recognition for their ICIP, their knowledge, and to prevent derogatory and offensive use, which extends to maintaining secrecy and privacy. And this, Kirsten already mentioned Indigenous data sovereignty, and that's a really important thing that we are finding is relevant to every single industry and every single matter that we're working on, is what's the connection between ICIP and Indigenous data sovereignty and privacy now. So it's a whole new world in that respect. I've had to learn a lot. If only I had Kirsten teach me all of that. So the big thing about ICIP, and I get this a lot when I'm working with GLAMs and when I'm working with universities, is ICIP a legal obligation? Simple answer is no, not yet. It's coming fast. there are currently no specific laws in Australia that protect ICIP in its entirety, right? We have laws dealing with heritage, we have laws dealing with specific elements of culture, we have laws dealing with access and benefit sharing. It's ad hoc. It is state-based as well as national, so we don't have an integrated system. However, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be ensuring that ICIP is protected and promoted and maintained in accordance with best practice. Best practice at an international level and really the kind of benchmark that we're all looking at in relation to ICIP is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Who here has seen Article 31? Oh, good, I'm glad. Those who haven't, jump online, check it out. So, big article for the Glamon universities and collections and archives sectors. It states that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions, which in Australia the terminology is still often used as ICIP. By way of information, ICIP was the original terminology in the Declaration while it was in draft form, and then it changed to cultural heritage, traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expression, but it means the same thing. So, Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect and develop their ICIP, as well as all the manifestations of that. So we're talking sciences, we're talking technologies, we're talking flora and fauna, genetic resources, we're also talking obviously arts, crafts, objects and so forth, all of the things that are covered by copyright law, literature and design. But then what's interesting about Article 31 and very, very important for all of us to recognise is it goes beyond that and says, in actual fact, Indigenous peoples not only have the right to maintain and control their ICIP, but they have the right to maintain, control, protect and develop their intellectual property, Western law intellectual property, over things that are incorporating their ICIP. So think about all of the copyright materials that have been created that incorporate ICIP. Of course, that's why we're here talking about it, because it's in collections, it's in our, libraries, our archives, our museums and our universities. So that is best practice at its best, and ultimately we want to see that entrenched in Australian law. Australia is a signatory to the UN Declaration. They just bloody well haven't embedded it yet. We'll get there. But I thought, and I'm sure that already working in the space where you're identifying that there is ICIP, obligations and responsibilities, how does it then work with copyright? And I know that we've been on this road now for quite a few years, but I thought a little slide on the distinctions just might be easy to visualise. I'm a real visual person, so being able to see something just makes it easier for me. So copyright, as we understand, expression is only protected when it's in material form. We know that ideas aren't protected. We know that styles and techniques, dot painting, rock, weaving techniques, they're not protected. It's the physical material form that's protected. We know that authorship is individual or jointly held by the creators, that copyright is an economic right. It can be bought, it can be sold, it can be licensed, and that it's assignable. You can also transfer copyright by way of written agreement. And that copyright's limited duration, life of the author plus 70 years on a general basis. When we're talking about ICIP, we're talking about cultural law here. So it is not about material form, and as we are aware, a lot of First Nations culture is oral culture, and that means copyright just does not often protect the form in which knowledge is passed down, except for the person who's usually the researcher that's recording that oral tradition, as we know. It's more than an obligation for material form. It is styles, it's underlying themes, and it is oral and performance-based. It's communal, and it's not ownership so much as custodianship. holding that knowledge communally, ensuring that it is handed down as cultural practice, generation to generation, and the rights continue. There's no end date on this. And I have an example coming up. And when I have workshops, we debate this a lot. Like, does cultural rights run out? And the simple answer is no. And they're debating it at WIPO and have been debating it at WIPO for a number of years in relation to the Intergovernmental Committee on Traditional Knowledge, Traditional Cultural Expression and Genetic Resources, whether a very well-known cultural object, does that run out? Does the ICIP considerations run out because it's so well known? And Australia's position, as it well should be, is that no, of course, there's no duration on the importance of this or the relevance. So this is a good example. Mimi arts, figures. Think about ancient rock art, right? From a copyright perspective, we've got some issues. Copyrights run out if we're talking about Western law, life of the author plus 70 years. So does that mean it no longer has cultural significance? Of course not. Yes, it does have cultural significance, and this is where ICIP has to be considered alongside copyright. Okay, copyright does not apply to ancient rock art that is over life of the author plus 70 years in age, but ICIP considerations, all those rights that I just showed you before, they still apply to the cultural information, the cultural knowledge, the cultural expression that is a part of that imagery. Another big gap, copyright law and ICIP, is language. Copyright does not protect language unless it's written down into a dictionary and it's in a material form. And so there was, you might very well have heard about the case of Powell a number of years ago. Wikipedia, like much of Wikipedia, has pages about everything, and one of those things is the Powell language. And we're talking about Tasmanian regeneration of a lost language, which is work being done by Aboriginal people in Tasmania through the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre. And they did not authorise information about the language to be incorporated on the wiki site, and it listed words, it listed phrases, it listed, you know, how to put words together, how to formulate sentences, and this caused extreme upset to Aboriginal people in Tasmania in particular. And so Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre approached Wikipedia and said, this is our knowledge, this is our language, we're working on revitalising our language. We did not give you permission to put this online. Guess what Wikipedia's response was? Copyright law. There's no copyright in language, it's just words. So we actually, Wikipedia, have no obligation to come and get permission from you. Back to what I was saying. IP, copyright, all of that side of things is but one consideration. Kirsten was also mentioning, you know, when you think about privacy and the obligations of privacy law, it's the same for ICIP. So whenever you're thinking about copyright, whenever you're thinking about other Western legal obligations in relation to your collections or your research or your project, also be thinking about what are the ICIP considerations. Do it at the same time. That seems to work in my brain really, really well. So it's something to consider. Challenges for ICIP protections, obviously nothing in no current legislation dealing specifically with ICIP, but we know that there are ongoing issues around Indigenous knowledge. ICIP, interchangeable, talking about the same thing. This report was commissioned by IP Australia back in 2019, and we assisted identifying issues for the protection and management of ICIP through our registered IP systems, so, you know, trademarks, patents, designs, that kind of thing. And what we came up with, key issues are misappropriation from a visual arts and crafts perspective, and I'll talk briefly about the current Commission report on that. Misuse of Indigenous languages, words and clan groups and names, and you know, as I just pointed out, there's no copyright in language unless it is bound up into a larger form, an immaterial form. So under current Western laws, you know, you can go about using an Indigenous language word even though you don't have connections to that language group. Misappropriation and misuse, basically that covers everything else. And importantly for all of us, recording, digitisation and publication of ICIP, and Kirsten already touched on the difficulties that come with considerations about changing the format of the information and the materials and the objects that have been placed in your care, your custodianship. And then use of Indigenous genetic resources and associated ICIP, and then protecting sacred and secret knowledge and private information from harm. And then the other thing to also consider now, and I've touched on this briefly, is Indigenous data sovereignty. How does ICIP and Indigenous data sovereignty work together? And when we're talking about, when I'm talking about Indigenous data sovereignty, I'm talking about the right of Indigenous people to control the data that's collected about them. Whether that's individually, so you know, personal information where we've got the Privacy Act that will come into play there, but then also their ICIP. So Indigenous data sovereignty can actually be a very broad umbrella for capturing not only ICIP but Indigenous people's personal information as well. And ultimately, much like ICIP rights, they should have the right to control and manage and access and use that data as they require. So much like ICIP, data shouldn't be collected unless there's free, prior, informed consent for that use. So we'll get on to that now. Recent stuff. So I was having to read through all of this again yesterday and I was like, wow. Thinking back to 10 years ago when I worked at Arts Law Centre and was like, we were just pushing stuff up a hill. It felt like there was never going to be any take-up of the reality of best practice around ICIP. To look back now and go, wow, we not only have Productivity Commission report on visual arts and crafts, we then also have the interim report on standalone legislation, so that sui generis law that I'm talking about that could actually be there holistically dealing with ICIP. And also we've had the Joint Standing Commission on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs come in with their inquiry about UNDRIP. So how are organisations, businesses, sectors using the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? And I really enjoyed writing that submission. It was fun. Everything, we use it in everything. So, Productivity Commission report. This actually stems from the 2018 parliamentary inquiry into fake art. You guys would have come across the whole fake art campaign, yep. So if you haven't already seen this, this is a very quick summary of what's going on. They identified all the issues that we've just been discussing, but focused on the visual arts and crafts sector. They released their report back in December last year, and they specifically provided recommendations to government to address key inefficiencies and issues that the sector face. Now, I found this interesting. Total sales of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander visual arts and crafts reached at least 250 million in 2019-2020, and I actually thought that figure was bigger, personally. I was like, oh, I thought it was bigger than that. But 250, that's pretty huge. This includes 35 million in artwork sales from art centres, which understandably you'd be like, yep, there's lots of Aboriginal art centres managing artists around Australia, and at least 80 million in the sales of merch, mostly souvenirs. Guess how many million were spent on non-Indigenous created souvenirs of Indigenous inspired motifs? Of the 80 million.
79.
Oh, not that bad, not that bad. But thank you for the suggestion. Bit lower than that. All right, I'm just going to call it 60 to 65% was on fake souvenirs. So that's a huge loss of the market to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists, not only from revenues, but obviously the demand for materials, and then also the impact to their culture, seeing misuse and misappropriation and replication of culture without consent and without due benefits being returned. So Productivity Commission at the end of the day said that there's heaps of gaps. Copyright law does not cover it, and we've just talked about some gaps. So we need something else. There's also not appropriate decision making around objectives and initiatives. Basically, we're missing a First Nations voice in relation to this industry, and why the hell is that? And so their recommendations, the big ones, are a suite of reforms. Yes, standalone legislation is the big one, right? But then they're also talking about coming to that reform with appropriate education and materials that will educate the sectors, educate the public. So it's not just that a standalone legislation appears out of friggin' nowhere and then nobody knows how to actually implement it. They're saying that it will come with appropriate internal policies and external policies and procedures to educate everybody about that. Big thing they call for is the National Indigenous Arts and Culture Authority, NIACA, to basically act as a peak body that can impose and actually has rights over the misuse of cultural knowledge and cultural information. What else did they say? That there's got to be an ICIP strategy across government, which was actually the first thing. Before they said a mandatory sui generis standalone legislation, they actually said ICIP needs to be incorporated across government, which I think is really, really great. We're seeing it in Victoria, starting with their self-determination policy across all government, and to be able to see ICIP coming into policy development would also be great. I liked the recommendation that there's a mandatory disclosure of non-Indigenous authorship. As a way, the concern was that using labelling to show authenticity, like we previously had an Aboriginal authentic tick logo that used to be used back in the early 2000s, that puts the obligation on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, whereas mandatory disclosure moves the obligation to non-Indigenous producers of Indigenous-inspired art. So that's really important as well. And then it talks about strengthening and bolstering the current workforce in the arts and visual arts and crafts sector, to actually, why is there not more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art workers? Why is there not more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art centre managers and also administrators? So these are the recommendations from that. Similarly, IP Australia and NINTI 1, they've come up with their interim report on a standalone legislation. So it's all happening at the same time, which is super exciting. And their suggested framework is that made up of 4 elements. And this interim report is like, here's our idea, and then they opened up for community feedback until November, and then now we're waiting for a final report which will actually identify a model for development of this standalone legislation. And so the elements are a legal right recognising communal ownership of IK, because as we know, copyright, individual joint ownership, our laws like to be able to identify a person who actually owns the copyright, whereas when we're talking about ICIP, we're talking about communal custodianship here, communal ownership. To fill the gaps where existing IP protections don't apply. Element 2 requires that measures to protect the trade of inauthentic products and promote authentic products. Similarly to the Productivity Commission, they say mandatory disclosure of non-Indigenous works and it goes beyond visual arts and crafts, but they also talk about, border security and how we're going to assist customs in relation to monitoring and managing of, inauthentic ICIP. Element 3 is to have its own NIACA, but this is an National Indigenous Knowledge Authority, which is a NICA, to have the power to administer and enforce misuse, including, imposing regulatory obligations in relation to the standalone legislation, and assisting with licensing of ICIP, and then also assisting Indigenous communities understand and implement the standalone legislation to support their ICIP protection and management. And then element 4 is what I just said, measures to support and build capacity. So that's what the interim report looks like, which is very exciting, and it's on a par, in line with the recent Joint Standing Committee on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs inquiry into the application of UNDRIP. And coming out of that, a lot of recommendations are based around sui generis legislation, that we need to have this standalone legislation, not this ad hoc, disparate, across states, different systems, but one that actually properly engages the United Nations Declaration all in one place. Okay, that was the boring stuff of our legislation, but it's also a really exciting time, and all of these reports are just coming out at speed. So we have a lot of momentum around protection of ICIP, which is so important for the GLAMs and unis to obviously lead the way. And strategies, we've talked about how ICIP is misused, but what are the strategies that, while we're waiting for this standalone legislation, what do we do? And this is what we tell people to do. So use those intellectual property laws where you can. Ensure that where possible, Indigenous people govern the collection, access and use of their cultural materials and their related data. And that they also own materials created that incorporate their ICIP. And this is something we've been promoting in particular with new resources being developed, as part of research projects for universities, for GLAMs, for schools, for other sectors, is what's wrong with ensuring that copyright ownership sits with First Nations people where it engages their knowledge, or at least joint ownership of copyright, and then a licence back for the particular use that you want to be making of that. And we see that a lot with projects that incorporate protocols now, is that they're working to also ensure that IP ownership stays with or sits with First Nations people, and then there's a licence back for particular use. Promote best practice using protocols. So where the IP laws and the privacy laws don't fully cover what needs to be protected, then we can come up with best practice protocols. While not legally binding, they go above and beyond what the law is capable of currently doing, and can be negotiated with for a particular project, or more holistically for a particular work environment, or even larger for an industry as a whole. And we work a lot in this space, working with communities, working with organisations like National Library of Australia, working with them to come up with best practice ICIP protocols to deal with ICIP and collections. And then, how do we make protocols legally binding? We stick them into a contract. So whenever you're engaging with communities as part of your work, entering into legal instruments that actually bind the parties to the best practice protocols that have been agreed upon, whether it's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or it's the IATSIS Code of Ethics, or it's the Australia Council protocols for engagement with First Nations artists, putting it into a contract and making it binding on the parties. The contract will usually deal with copyright ownership as well, but now throw in ICIP, and then also, how about you throw in discussion about Indigenous data sovereignty and how that's actually going to work? How are communities going to be able to access their data that's associated with the work that you're doing? So that's our strategies. All three work together. Okay. Protocols, they're big in certain industries. The arts protocols have been around for more than a decade in the arts. That's through the Australia Council, and you would have all seen IATSIS's Code of Ethics. Yes? Yes, everybody, go and have a look at IATSIS Code of Ethics. We're talking an industry best practice protocol that you can work towards, and then you can create your own protocols for your particular area of work. So industry protocols, for example, I've gone through all of those already. Got to add in the old school ATSILEARN, bit out of date now, but, you know, still, it's a good start, okay? Needs some work on that now. Same with that CEDA protocols, bit out of date now, but, you know, we've got a starting base from which we, from an industry perspective, if industry gets behind it, could actually be adapted to be more applicable to the current times. We recently just worked with the Queensland Department of Education and came up with protocols for all schools in Queensland, which I thought was pretty cool. And then NINTI 1, ethical guidelines. I'm big into the bush foods and biological resources space, and currently there isn't an industry-specific protocol, though I'm writing them for every state. We've got one in Victoria coming out soon, so I'm hoping that'll become a bigger, or a national, we'll be able to get a national protocol out there soon. So, protocols in practice, who's already doing this work? And it is led by the GLAMs and the unis. You guys are ahead of the game, and so it's really important to be having a look at what other people are doing already, but coming up with those ways of engaging, ways of managing, ways of actually addressing, you know, the impacts of colonisation on the collections that you have, and making for a safe space for Indigenous communities to be engaging as well. Now, research, and Rose is going to talk about the impact of ICIP directly in relation to research, but these are the True Tracks principles that Terri, Janke and company have came up with a number of years ago. And we use these as the basis for creating protocols for every industry, every organisation, every research project that we deal with. And it's something that you can consider as well, right? So you've got the industry protocols out there, like IATSIS Code of Ethics and the National Health and Medical Research Council ethical guidelines that you've got to comply when we're dealing with health research. But then what about for your particular project? You know, why don't you stop? And Kirsten, you said at one point, like, it was about what you could do. You know, identifying what you can do in the space you're in. And something like the True Tracks principles could provide a foundation for you to be coming up with an appropriate protocol with community groups that you're working with, guided by them as well. So True Tracks principles are respect. Got to respect ICIP in accordance with United Nations Declaration. Self-determination, that we're ensuring self-determination of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in relation to their ICIP, and this extends to their data as well. Consent and consultation is actually the wrong way round. Consultation and then seeking free, prior informed consent for use, but it actually goes beyond that, because it's about ensuring that there's a First Nations voice in relation to any collection, access or use of ICIP material. So it's more about Indigenous leadership, co-design of the work that you're doing, not just going and consulting on an established thing that you want to do. It's about what does community seek from this? How can it help benefit them? Interpretation, we talked about that. First Nations people are best placed to interpret their own culture. We've also got to maintain the integrity. Yes, the history of what's happened in the past, but also the integrity of the material. Secrecy and privacy, ensuring that that kind of material is not disclosed. Attribution, ensuring appropriate attribution for community and ICIP rights holders in relation to use of their ICIP, and that follows on with benefit sharing. What are the benefits going back to community? And then maintaining Indigenous culture. What are you guys doing to ensure the maintenance and support and ongoing strength of Indigenous culture? And then recognition and protection. So that's using that strategy I suggested before. Use the IP laws where you can and the privacy laws. Engage in best practice protocol development, and then stick it all in a contract. And you've got a legally binding obligation to act in the best interests of First Nations people. Talked about that, and we've provided examples, and I think I've gone way over. I have, haven't I? Sorry, Rose. And there's some takeaways. I'm not going to repeat them. So, yeah, take a photo. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you so much for that, Anika. Next up, we have Rose Barrowcliffe.
I've got, yeah. Am I just going next? Hi, everyone. I will zoom through because Kirsten and Anika have covered a lot of the stuff I was going to cover, but let me just start by paying my respects to the Ngunnawal people as the original knowledge holders and ongoing custodians of the knowledge of this lands. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about looking at copyright beyond the commercial value of copyright, and my interest in copyright really has come from the issues of discoverability and access to records. So copyright has a legacy of dispossession for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from their knowledge, and which we've already heard a lot about. And I, in my space working within an archival institution, but as a researcher, have sort of explored some tools to interrupt that legacy. So when I say institutions, I'm talking about archives, libraries, and universities, which are the three spaces that I've kind of had experience working across. So my research is, I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Macquarie University, and in my professional role, as Sarah has mentioned, I'm the First Nations Archives Advisor at Queensland State Archives. So in those roles, I'm really looking at how we are addressing issues or lack of Indigenous data sovereignty and ICIP within archives and collections. So I really started out being more interested in the right to know, but soon realised that you can't enact the right to know if you can't find those records in the first place. So my interest in right to know quickly shifted to trying to understand discoverability and access in records. Let me just skip that. I'm just going to try to skip forward so we don't go too far over time. So what I see in my research, which is about the representation of Indigenous peoples in archives, is that copyright licensing directly impacts on the discoverability and access. No, I will. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. It's all good. Yeah, so it directly impacts on the discoverability and access of records that relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And while the Copyright Act doesn't have any sort of provisions about records access, but what it does is it sets up a situation where the copyright owner has the authority and is the person who gets to decide on matters of access. So, okay. So from November 2021 to February 2022, I conducted an audit for NESLA. So I know there's some NESLA people in the audience. Hello. So it was an audit of some of the Indigenous, contemporary Indigenous collections at some of the state libraries and the National Library here, our hosts today. So the broad remit was to look at how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were represented in these collections, but then there were specific goals within that. And I've highlighted on the screen here three of the ones where I really saw the impact of copyright on that. So one of the themes that emerged from the audit was that the way that the materials were acquired directly impacted on how well Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders were were represented in that collection and their agency within that in relation to that collection. So of the 16 collections that I audited, only 5 collections contained materials that were created by Indigenous people. So that's only 30% of contemporary Indigenous collections. So the definition of contemporary was it had been acquired in the past 10 years. Only 30% acquired were where Indigenous people were the copyright owners and had that agency or the authority to decide to be part of that acquisition process. So I realise it's a small sample size, but really I think those sample collections that were put forward were some of the best examples that the libraries had to offer. So I think if we looked at more collections, those results would be iterated or actually probably give worse results possibly. So this is a problem because what I found is that when the state and national libraries were acquiring materials for the collection, it's the copyright holder who negotiates the terms of sale or the donation often. So they get to decide what institution the materials get transferred to, or the restricted access period, or who can access the records, or even that the records be completely open access. So we've already heard that that in itself is complex, privacy issues, but also secret. When materials are secret and sacred, it becomes a real issue. So not only that, but the donor or the vendor, again, often the copyright holder, is often the person who helps describe those materials and gives context around those materials. So what I saw is that records that were described from a non-Indigenous worldview often left out important information that would make those records discoverable to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the communities that those records are about often. So the person who captures that knowledge in material form, their name went on the record, for example, but not the name of the Indigenous community that material came from or that knowledge had come from, not the name of the important Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that might have been contained in those records, or if it was a cultural practice or any sort of protocols are used. None of that information was captured because the person who was giving all that information about the record possibly didn't even know that information when they were transferring those records to the archive or the library. So let me just, again, I'm going to skip forward. So if we think about how to interrupt that legacy where we've got all these materials in collecting institutions that are not described from an Indigenous worldview because of the way they've been acquired or the pipeline of how they've come into the institution. And so then how do we deal with that? And here, if I look at each of these institutions operates in a very different way. Obviously, national and state archives have very little autonomy about how, what materials they collect and how they come into their institutions, and they're dealing with heritage materials or legacy materials. So oftentimes the copyright of the materials they have might already have been expired, or it has already expired, but the legacy of that copyright ownership is still ongoing because now they've got, at QSA we've got something like 3.5 million records. Only 6% of those records have ever been accessed because they are described inadequately. Not to say all of those records relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but it's just an indication of how inaccessible poor description makes the records. And then national and state libraries have more autonomy. They can decide what they want to collect, who they collect from, how it's described. They can be more proactive about the access conditions, and so they sit somewhere in the middle. And then academic institutions like a university is very proactive about creating knowledge and deciding what they're funding with their research and what sort of data has been gathered. So there's different ways that I see to sort of interrupt this legacy of copyright on ICIP. Okay, so I just want to, I'll skip forward to 2 examples basically. The first one is this is a screenshot from one of the records at Queensland State Archives, and Des Crump there is working on identifying the languages material that we have at QSA, and a lot of that material is sitting in government records or a correspondence, and had previously been sitting there unidentified, inaccessible, not discoverable. So the first step is about attribution and connecting that information and that record back to the Indigenous and the traditional knowledge holders. So Des is doing that by using the Auslang language codes, and I want to recognise Beck in the work that has been done here at NLA and Trove, which we were inspired by and have sort of been implementing that now at QSA. So once Des has been able to find the records that relate to First Nations and identifying the First Nations, the next step is running languages workshop where we can connect those communities back to those records, and then we're going to look at, okay, how do we appropriately manage those records in future according to the community's wishes. And the other one, I've actually just come back from training on this one in Aotearoa, and many of you, Kirsten had this up on the screen before, with Mukatu, and I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the local context labels, often referred to as traditional knowledge labels, but there's traditional knowledge labels. They also have biocultural labels, which is specific obviously to biocultural information, and then there's notices. So what's interesting from an institutional point of view is that I think often there is hesitancy to wade into this area of, oh, we've got all this material, we've got all this legacy material, and we know it belongs to Indigenous people, but we're really, really nervous about how we start talking to them about it, because maybe we've acquired it in a way that wasn't ethical, or it's from an old model, we don't have the best relationship with the community, that sort of thing. So the traditional knowledge notices and the biocultural notices allow institutions to just simply flag that they have the material without overstepping the mark and trying to put labels on that material or identify even who it belongs to. It's simply saying, in our collections, we have Indigenous knowledge. And they put that notice on there, and then trying to reach out to communities, and it's communities and communities only that are allowed to put labels on that knowledge. So it's a very structured system. Each player in the local context system has their own profiles and authority within that, but the authority to label traditional knowledge always and only sits with the community. So in my postdoctoral research, I'm looking at implementing this again at Queensland State Archives. I anticipate that this will be a tool that will be used more and more in collecting institutions. Certainly in Aotearoa, there's some amazing applications going on, as well as in Turtle Island, North America at the moment. So I see that growing in the future. So just in summary, I didn't really get to the research part of things, but I'm very much focused right now on enriching metadata. Again, you can't do anything with the record if you can't find it in the first place. So you can't address ICIP if you don't even know what you've got and you don't know it's there. So that's what I'm focusing on at the moment. So once you've identified that you've got the materials, the next step is attributing it back to the Indigenous knowledge owners. And then partnering with the communities, but them very much as the authority and the decision makers on what happens with that knowledge. In doing so, supporting cultural authority, and then the last step, we hope, would be some form of repatriation. I know in Queensland we're having discussions, well, the Premier has just talked about we're going to treaty. She's introducing the bill to Parliament next Wednesday. So I anticipate as part of the treaty process that repatriation of records and knowledge is going to be a big part of that. And I think that might be me. Thank you.
Rose. It was really interesting. I know that we're a little bit over our time schedule, but if anyone has any questions for the panel, please feel free to put your hand up. And no questions? Oh, we've got one over here. I'll just run it up.
Oh, I can just speak loudly.
Okay. Oh, it's probably for people on the live stream, it's probably better to have a mic.
Thank you, Rose. This may be too big a question, so I apologise in advance. But when you were talking about the importance of metadata, I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on what kinds of metadata projects you're envisioning and how they can be implemented.
I actually find at an institutional level, metadata projects are both intimidating but something of a relief because they're something really tangible that can be started on. So at QSA at the moment, we are working with the Community and Personal Histories team, which has been the team to do all the archival research for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are looking for their family history. And they hold a wealth of knowledge, and they sit separate to QSA. They're physically at QSA, but they're not part of the QSA structure. And they, over the years, 20 years they've been doing this, they have developed their own finding aids. So they have all this information about the series and sometimes at a record level of who appears in those records or what town or who, pertinent information that makes it really easy for them to be able to respond to inquiries from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But because they're not part of the QSA structure, that information has never gone back into the metadata of the records. So there was an inefficiency in the loop there, but there's also a privacy concern, right? So we don't want that information to be published openly on the public catalogue search function. So what we're looking at is identifying the most used series that CPH relies on, and then putting the names in sort of like I don't know what software everyone uses, but we have gateways, so CPH and government agencies, they can see a level of metadata that the general public can't see, and the archivists can see that as well. So we're not making it public, we're not infringing on anyone's privacy, but we are improving efficiency at being able to find records that relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in that way.
This is probably more of a comment than a question. I know everyone hates that so much. But there's lots of things that libraries are doing in terms of the addition of language code headings to subject headings, the use of IASIS subject terms, the inclusion of cultural safety, safety notices in our catalogue records, so that there's this, and the identification that this collection contains material that has ICIP in it. So these are all practical and tangible things that can be done straight away to increase the discoverability. In the library context, we're probably less likely to have the intensely private material, but just by noting that language is included and that it's about a particular community, and we use the right name for that community, and we change our headings, so when Fraser Island becomes Gari, we change it to Gari in the catalogue, and then every time anyone is looking at that subject heading, they are seeing the things that are important from a First Nations perspective to describing the things that we've described exclusively through a colonial lens until that change has happened. There's lots that can be done. Sorry, there's no question.
Well, that raises a really important point, which goes back to the first question. The one thing we're not doing in this process is erasing any pre-existing metadata. We would never advocate for that. That is part of the story and the provenance of that record, but we might be moving it to a location where it's not as visible, especially in the case of derogatory or racist language, for example. So still maintaining the integrity of the metadata that's there, but that's why we say enriching, not changing, or yeah, I'm not sure what else you would say.
Can I just add one thing as the provocation of living archives on country that, you know, I'd encourage in terms of the treaty process and where we're at nationally and our role in truth-telling to start to think about the handback. And I think that while all these first steps are great, we're not actually thinking ahead to how material needs to be with communities. It can't be sitting just solely in these national institutions. We actually have to think about community, maintaining culture and keeping their well-being in a way that we're not seeing now.
Yeah, it's definitely a first step, the first of many steps, but yeah, it's not the end goal.
Sorry, I just sneaking one last one in. Just going back to what Kirsten said earlier about supporting that return of items to community. How do you see that kind of working in practice? Would you like to see the government actually providing, say, some grants or something like that so that communities can, I guess, enrich the facilities that they have in their local spaces to, you know, display or preserve or, you know, even just maintain those collections that, fingers crossed, will be returned?
I don't think we have the answers, but we have to invest in asking the questions and doing it in partnership with community, and I don't think one model will work, but we do need a significant investment in maintaining culture locally, and we have to stop thinking about extraction in a way that, you know, it's not fulfilling communities' long-term needs. So I don't know that we have the answers, but I think that's part of, you know, the investment that GLAM can have is to start to have these really important conversations. I don't think there's going to be one standard approach at all, but we need to get there.
Thank you all. I think we'll wrap it up there for questions. I think everyone is quite ready for a cup of tea and some afternoon tea as well. So thank you so much. Just join me in giving one more round of applause to our panelists.